So 1 Samuel chapter 18, starting in verse 1. Now when he had finished speaking to Saul, speaking of David, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house any more. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Now it had happened as they were coming home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women had come out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him, and he said, They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day forward. So if we remember, it was a month ago, because I skipped ahead. But if you remember, a month ago, David had just come back from slaying Goliath and having the great victory over the Philistines there. And it was at that point, at least for the time being, that the Philistines were going to be in subjection to Israel. They had won remember the wager that Goliath had put up. Hey, just send your strongest man, and whoever fights me, if they win, then we'll be your servants. So we're told that he meets with Saul. Saul's obviously impressed. I mean, David just won the war for Israel for Saul, at least in Saul's eyes. But Jonathan was also there. And after seeing David come up from his father's fields and seeing how he trusted in the Lord to take on Goliath, Jonathan could see something very similar to himself in David. If you remember earlier in chapter 14, Jonathan had the courage to go up with his armor bearer and take on the Philistine army. Remember, he kind of sneaks out of camp with his armor bearer, and he says, Hey, look, I'm going to take on the Philistine army. Are you with me? And his armor bearer says, Hey, do whatever pleases you. I'm here to support you. And they go on, and they make it sound like Israel is attacking, full-on attacking. The whole Philistine camp just goes into confusion, and they end up slaying a bunch of Philistines. Because Jonathan knew, look, we're not supposed to, as God-fearing people, we're not supposed to fear man. What can man do to me? What did we just sing tonight? If our God is for us, who could ever stop us? If our God is with us, who could stand against us? Jonathan understood that. Saul didn't. And so now he sees David, a young man like himself, coming out from his father's fields there to deliver bread and cheese to his brothers, his older brothers, and he sees that, hey man, this David guy, he's a lot like me. We've got the same kind of interests, It's kind of like if you're a car guy and, you're walking down the street and all of a sudden you both see a 57 Chevy and you both are like, wow. And you all of a sudden feel that connection. Oh, wow, you like cars? And you start talking about cams and carburetors and pistons and, this and that and stuff I wish I knew a lot more about. So David and Jonathan, hey man, you trust in the Lord to fight your battles, and I've done the same thing, and man, this is great. So they become good friends. It says to the fact that Jonathan even gives David his armor, his clothing, and says, look, you deserve this way more than I do. I didn't even have the courage to take on Goliath. You did. And they made a covenant. And really, from this point on, they became best friends. And so there's a great, and we'll see throughout as we continue on this friendship that David and Jonathan have. Just great friends. It's a good picture of what a godly friendship should look like. But David didn't just impress Jonathan; he also impressed Saul, which is saying a lot. because Saul seemed to only ever be impressed by himself. Anytime there was a battle won, Saul loved to claim the victory for himself. But he impressed Saul, and from that point on, David would no longer be serving in his father's fields. Now, at this point, he was a court musician. He would come in and out. They'd call, "Hey, David, we need you to do another concert in the courts." Saul's having one of his fits, being distressed by one of those spirits again, and you can really slay on the harp, and so we need you to play that real quick. And he would do that, but he'd always go back to his father's fields and tend to the sheep and still be the youngest of his brothers. But from this point on, he would no longer be serving in his father's fields, tending to the sheep. It seemed, at least at this point, as if his life was going to be really good from now on. Hey, I just slayed Goliath. I won the battle for Israel. I'm a very popular guy. Saul now wants me to just hang out with him all the time. He set me over the men of war. And it even says in verse 5 that he was accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of all Saul's servants. There was not even envy or bitterness towards David. Like, who's this little shepherd boy? I've been serving Saul for, 6 years now. And where'd he come from? He's accepted. People loved him. Seemed really good. Another thing that I think is great is it says that David behaved wisely. There at the beginning of verse 5. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved wisely. In the life of David, as we saw before, we don't see him acting prematurely to the calling of the Lord. He had been anointed. At this point, he had been anointed king. Samuel went and visited him and anointed him king in front of his family. And so David knew, hey, at some point I'm supposed to be king. If I'm a Hollywood director, it's going to be now. Right after I defeated Goliath and won the war. And everyone loves me. It's the perfect time. But he never acted prematurely. He knows that the Lord has anointed him king, but it was not yet his time. Very similar as when Christ, when he was on the earth. His disciples were egging him on. Come on, set up your kingdom now. Set up your kingdom now. Christ says, no, it's not my time, or that's not what I came here to do. However, as the story goes on, once they return from the battle and they start getting towards Israel, they start seeing the women coming out from all the cities with their tambourines, and they're dancing and they're singing. And I'm sure Saul had this huge grin on his face. Ah, my welcoming party. They can't wait to greet their fearless leader who just won in battle against the Philistines. And he starts getting closer and closer and closer and thinking, in the back of his mind, he's chanting, Saul, 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 Saul. We want Saul, And as he gets closer, he hears Saul. Here's his name. And I'm sure at first his ears perked up. What are they singing about me over there? Saul has slain his thousands. Why, yes, I have. Yes, I have. Thank you. Actually, it was 3,649 to be exact, but I wasn't counting. But yes, thousands. Thank you. But it goes on. And David is tens of thousands. Oh, I'm doing his math. Well, tens of thousands is a lot more than thousands. And from that point on, things take a turn for the worse. The news of David's great victory had reached home. The truth of the story got there before Saul could sound his own trumpet, toot his own horn. And the people loved it. Just like in today's day and age, everyone loves a good comeback story, a good underdog. In sports. When I'm watching, I know me personally, when I'm watching two teams I don't have really any interest in, I always try and root for the underdog. Because it's cool to see the top dog go down. A little shepherd boy who wasn't even part of the military, no military training experience, comes and defeats Goliath, who everyone, including Saul, was afraid of. But again, with Saul, with Saul, the problem is he's not the hero. David is. Saul was always focused on himself. Instead of relishing in the fact that Israel had won and defeated Goliath and defeated the Philistine army. And people were, he was still getting praise. They didn't say David slayed his tens of thousands and Saul sat there and did nothing. They still had said, hey, you still did a good job, Saul. But the fact is that he wasn't number one, and that really irked him. He even has a pity. He has his own party, a pity party. What more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul loves attention, but he doesn't like when people outshine him. Now, what's unfortunate about this is how most people view leadership. They think that if you're the leader, that you are supposed to be the best, that the leader is supposed to be the shining star. And it's all about them. Well, if they're the leader, that means they are the best. That means this and that. But in reality, a true leader is the one who provides a platform for others to shine. Now again, I'm sorry if you don't follow football, but the NFL draft just happened last week, and my Cleveland Browns got the number one pick for the 18 millionth year in a row. And they picked a guy who was totally unexpected, Baker Mayfield out of Oklahoma. He was ranked like the number 6 quarterback coming into the draft. And he got picked number 1 overall. And everyone's freaking out. Why would are the Cleveland Browns just that bad that they would pick Baker Mayfield over these other guys that every pro scout has at number 1? Well, I was actually reading an article today, and the vice president of the Browns, which isn't saying a lot, said that the reason they picked him is because of how he acted around others, how he built others up, how he created others for other people to shine. He bettered others around him. It wasn't just the Baker Mayfield show. It was, hey, he wanted to make sure that his wide receivers and his running back and his offensive linemen were also doing good and doing well. And they said, we wanted a guy like that, not a guy who's going to come in and be the star, the quarterback that's going to save the Cleveland Browns. That's impossible. But see, that is a true leader. A true leader isn't stepping on top of everyone else. A true leader is building everyone up and holding everyone up. Giving other people a reason, or giving other people a chance to shine. In fact, Jesus even lived this out. In John 14:12, he said to his disciples, most assuredly I say to you, he who believes in me, the works that I do, he will do also, and greater works than these he will do, because I go to my Father. Jesus himself doesn't say, look, I'm going to do, you guys can never amount to anything. And that is the difference between the Spirit-led leader and the flesh-driven leader. Saul only cared about himself, not building others up. Verse 10. And it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house. So David played music with his hand, as at other times, but there was a spear in Saul's hand, and it wasn't used for drumming. And Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped his presence twice. Now Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from his presence and made him his captain over 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. And David behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Therefore when Saul saw that he behaved very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, because he went out and came in before them. We found out before that the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul. Saul had finally, it was too much. He disobeyed the Lord by not utterly wiping out the Amalekites. Before that, he decided to take matters into his own hands and become a priest and offer offerings on the altar instead of waiting for Samuel. Not to mention all the other things he might have done. And at that point, Samuel told Saul, the Spirit of the Lord is going to depart from you now. The Lord's hand is no longer on your kingdom. He's going to find a man after his own heart. And from that point on, the Lord had sent a distressing spirit. And then when the distressing spirit would come, the only way that he would be calmed down is when David would play his harp. David would play music. Now here again this happens, as at other times. Saul had a distressing spirit. He starts acting all crazy. A lot of the commentators believe that here it says in verse 10 that he prophesied, and that's not to think that he was giving praise to the Lord or that he was telling the future, but more acting as a prophet, idle babbling, kind of just saying words, acting a little crazy out of his mind. When you read through the Old Testament and read some of the stuff that the prophets did, they did seem a little out of their mind if it wasn't directed from the Lord. And so Saul was kind of acting like that, and the only way to get him to settle down again was playing music. But instead of David simply being a court musician, again, Saul didn't really know who David was before Goliath. But instead of just being that guy who plays the harp every now and again, now he's David who has outshined Saul. David who defeated Goliath. David who had slain tens of thousands and Saul only thousands. And I'm sure that as Saul sat there with the spear in his hand and looked at David playing the harp to calm him down, he looked at David as if he were a goody-goody, a teacher's pet. Now he's trying to calm, the audacity that David can calm down Saul, that he can defeat Goliath and now calm down Saul. The audacity of this young man, Saul is probably thinking. And this incensed Saul, and he actually tries to kill him. He says, I'm going to pin David to the wall with his spear. I mean, it's not just, he tries. However, after he calms down, after he misses, David escapes, Saul realized that he didn't want to mess with David because he says that the Spirit of the Lord was with him. Because he behaved wisely in verse 15, he was afraid of him. He was afraid of him. Evil cannot stand righteousness. Cannot stand it. When people are evil, they just can't stand when you're righteous. Maybe you've experienced that at your workplace. Everyone's going out, partying on the Friday night. Hey, you coming with us? No, And then just the contempt that comes from that. The fact that you don't do that. Oh, you think you're better than us? Evil cannot stand. There are those that think that we must fight back against the devil by some sort of pseudo-military force, spiritual military. And yes, we are at war, spiritually speaking, but Christ speaks very differently. Christ doesn't speak that we're just an all-out attack. Again, we're told here that David behaves wisely, very wisely. Christ speaks of loving our enemies, turning the other cheek, and not retaliating when we are wronged. Jesus, in those days, in Jesus' days, if a Roman centurion told you to carry his stuff for a mile, you had to. If not, you could be arrested or who knows what. Jesus tells him, hey, if he tells you to go a mile, go 2 miles. Just to show him that, you care for him. That it's okay. We're going to see this principle that David has lived out in his life as we study more and more. All the times that Saul tries to kill David, David could have whipped out a sling and said, pow, right boop. You thought Goliath was hard. Well, Saul's easy, Saul's going to be easy. No, he doesn't do that, though. He never retaliates against Saul. In fact, there's a couple chances where David actually has the opportunity to kill Saul. And there's even people egging him on to do it. Come on, do it. You have this chance. And instead, David shows him, look, Saul, I had this opportunity. Check the corner of your robe. There's a piece missing, isn't it? Doesn't it look like this? It's because I was that close to you. And your bodyguard. Not much of a bodyguard. He doesn't retaliate. He doesn't lash out at, he doesn't take the spear and throw it back at him. Verse 17. Well, one more thing I did want to point out too is in verse 16 it says, all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. Again, a sign of a good leader is they're among the people. They're not hovering over the people. Again, standing on top of the people. And today in churches, and it's sad that the pastor is kind of viewed as this first class. It's like, church is almost like flying nowadays, where you have first class and business class and economy. And you might get to walk through business class and get to see what life is like, but there's actually a commercial out right now that says first class is there to show you that you don't belong in first class. And there's a lot of churches that act that way. The pastor's got his inner circle, and they kind of move throughout the camp, and no one can touch the pastor, get to the pastor, and he's got more protection than the president. Because I can't, and I shared this with you before too, there was a man who calls himself a pastor, although I don't believe he is, who says that he had to get a private jet because he can't be around those demon-possessed people on regular flights. Because he's a man of God, and that can't be right. But David went out and came in before them. He was among the people. He never viewed himself as anything but just, hey, I'm just like one of you guys. The Lord's called me to something different. Verse 17. Then Saul said to David, here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, let my hand not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. So David said to Saul, who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? But it happened at that time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel the Mahalathite as a wife. Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. So Saul said, I will give her to him, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall be my son-in-law today. And Saul commanded his servants, communicate with David secretly, and say, look, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now therefore become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servants spoke those words in the hearing of David, and David said, does it seem to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing I am poor and lightly esteemed? I am a poor and lightly esteemed man. And the servants of Saul told him, saying, in this manner David spoke. Then Saul said, thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. Now the days had not expired, therefore David arose and went, he and his men, and killed 200 men of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full count to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, as a wife. Thus Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was still more afraid of David, so Saul became David's enemy continually. Then the princes of the Philistines went out to war, and so it was, whenever they went out, that David behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name became highly esteemed. Now in this section, this story, Saul tries to get crafty and get David killed by the Philistines. He really sets up this whole elaborate plan to have his daughter stumble him. I mean, what a wicked man. Using his own daughters for his own gain against his so-called enemy. To stumble him. Again, we just see the drifting away of Saul from the Lord. Further and further and further. Now using his own daughters. Trying to use his own daughters. Well, it doesn't work with the first one. David says, "Who am I? What is my life or my father's family in Israel that I should be the son-in-law to the king?" David remains humble. Again, he doesn't take advantage of the situation. You know what? Lord, this makes sense. I'm supposed to be I'm anointed king. And if I'm the king's son-in-law, well, guess what? I might be next up on the throne. Lord, it's all working out. No, David remains humble. In fact, in the New Testament, we're told that when you enter someone's house, don't sit in the high seat, in the special seat, thinking that, hey, I'm the honorary guest here. But rather, sit amongst the people, and if you are the honorary guest, let someone exalt you, but lest you exalt yourself. David showing that picture of humility. Again, he doesn't take advantage. David realizes it's a weighty matter to be a part of the royal family, and now twice he rejects it, just being given the opportunity. First time with Merab, and then she's given to another guy. And then Michal. Now Michal's a little different, because it says that Michal loved David. And his servants tell Saul, now you would think as a good father, you find out your daughter loves this great man of God, and instead of saying, oh, this sounds so great, he says, ooh, perfect, I'll get him to stumble. I'll use her. Saul's only thinking about himself. It's actually not until Saul says that he must bring proof that he killed 100 Philistine men. David, throughout his life, understands that sacrifice, that things must be earned in a way. There's one of the stories when David is fleeing Saul. He's thirsty. He cries out for water. And so a group of his right-hand men sneak into the city, occupied by his enemies, go to the well, get some water, and bring it back to David. And he goes, how can I drink this water, which has cost me nothing? You guys are giving your life for this water. And he pours it out as really an offering, as a thank offering. I can't take this. And the same thing of being the king's son-in-law. He's not just going to take it. Not until he has to do something for it. Sacrifice something for it. Even the gift of salvation requires sacrifice. It required the greatest sacrifice. Christ dying for us. But even when we come to Christ, it requires us to sacrifice ourselves. To nail ourselves to the cross with Christ. To die with Christ. Knowing that when we do that, He will raise us up again. For if we die with Him, we shall be raised up with Him, the Bible says. David understood that there's sacrifice. Saul, on the other hand, he loved to steal the glory from others. Like when his son Jonathan went into the camp of the Philistines and he starts blowing the trumpet, making it look like it was his great idea, it was his victory. And then we notice that when David and his men go and do this, that he actually did double. Saul asked for 100. David kills 200 men of the Philistines. And again, the Lord is glorified in David's life. Double. The Lord will do and give us more abundantly that what we can think of. When you ask the Lord, I don't know how many times this happened in my own life. I've asked the Lord for something, and He's given me far more than I was just asking for a little bit. Lord, you get me a lot of that. When I prayed to the Lord for a wife, it's like just someone who's got like 2 eyes, 2 arms, and can look at me most of the time. That's all. That was, because that's all I deserved. Like, if that, exceedingly abundantly, more than we can think or ask. That's what happens when we're working with the Lord. Now, what's interesting, though, about these events that Saul sets up, tries to have David killed by he tells David to go kill 100 Philistine men because he's like, well, he's not going to accomplish that. The Philistines will kill him. He got lucky with Goliath. Not this time. What's interesting is that when David is king, he does the very same thing to Uriah. He sets up Uriah to be killed because of his own sin. Saul, because of his sin of envy and jealousy and anger, set this up. And David, for his sin of pride and lust and adultery and eventually murder. It's interesting how the enemy can tempt us into things that we maybe even once victims of. It also goes to show you that no man is too far that he can't fall. You would think, like David learned from this, oh man, I would never do anything like that. Verse 1 of chapter 19. Now Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. And guys just got it out for him. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted greatly in David. So Jonathan told David, saying, my father seeks to kill you, therefore please be on your guard until morning, and stay in a secret place and hide. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak with my father about you. Then what I observe I will tell you. Thus Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his works have been very good toward you. For he took his life in his hands and killed the Philistine, Goliath. And the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all Israel. Not just you, Saul, but all Israel. He saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood to kill David without a cause? So Saul heeded the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore, as the Lord lives, he shall not be killed. Then Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these things. So Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence, as in times past. Now at the beginning of this chapter, we see that Saul just can't stand to see the Lord working in David's life. I mean, he gave him these impossible tasks of killing 100 Philistine men. He comes back with 200. And now he's married to his daughter who loves him. What's worse? His son is David's best friend. In Saul's mind, his world is crumbling around him. He's losing all his influence, all his power. So he gets everyone together. We just got to get rid of this guy. He's a nuisance. But Jonathan reminds him, look, he's done nothing but good towards you. Not just towards you, but towards all Israel. And you're supposed to be leading Israel, right? Shouldn't you rejoice? What this goes to show is not just the outward, but the inward of a man's heart. That there are those that used to be used by the Lord. Saul remembered, man, I was used by the Lord once, but now cannot stand to see others used. Envy and jealousy are not fruits of the Spirit. They're fruits of the flesh. Saul was obviously guided and directed by his flesh. It saddens me, as a younger pastor, to hear older guys talk down on our generation or this or that. Back in the Jesus movement, we used to do this, we used to do that, and you young guys can't get off your cell phones. Well, we probably can't, you're right. But the Lord is still trying to use us. He hasn't given up on us. And it's not just an age thing, but it's just an anyone thing. When we see the Lord using someone, we should rejoice. As Jonathan had to remind Saul, his own dad, look, the Lord's using David. We should just rejoice. Leave him alone. Let the Lord use him. And other churches and other ministries are growing and booming and, you know. If the Lord is using them, we should rejoice. Not be envious and jealous. And so when Jonathan hears that Saul wants to kill David, he speaks up for David. And it's good that we should speak up for righteousness' sake, and reminds his father all that the Lord had done at Saul's own benefit here. And so Saul calms down and says, all right, well, you're back in the fold here for a minute. But verse 8, and there was war again, and David went out and fought with the Philistines and struck them with a mighty blow, and they fled from him. Now the distressing spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand. You know, just a guy like that probably shouldn't have a spear in his hand. Certain people should not have spears in their hands. And David was playing music with his hand. Then Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he slipped away from Saul's presence, and he drove the spear into the wall. So David fled and escaped that night. Saul also sent messengers to David's house to watch him and to kill him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. And Michal took an image and laid it in the bed, put a cover of goat's hair for his head, and covered it with clothes. So when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, he is sick. You thought teenagers were the first ones to come up with that. But no, Michal and David. Then Saul sent the messengers back to see David, saying, bring him up to me in the bed, that I may kill him. And when the messengers had come in, there was the image in the bed with a cover of goat's hair for his head. Then Saul said to Michal, why have you deceived me like this, and sent my enemy away so that he had escaped? Michal answered Saul, he said to me, let me go, why should I kill you? Yet again, Saul tries to kill David. But this time, David runs away, and with help from his wife. The person that Saul thought he could use to trap David was the one helping David to escape his hand. What the enemy uses for evil, God will certainly use for good. In our life, the enemy, oh man, I got this guy trapped. I'm going to set this thing here in place. It's going to ruin them. Joseph proclaimed that to his brothers in Genesis 50:20. Hey, what you guys meant for evil, God's used for good. You guys sold me into slavery to get rid of me. Now I'm saving you because of that. Job, another great story, has everything besides his very grateful wife taken away from him, riches and all, and in the end, he has double what he had in the first place. I mean, if that's the economics, Lord, I'm not actually asking, but I might want the enemy to start trying to get me to stumble. But what the enemy used for evil, God used for good. And notice what they do here. David escapes through a window. Now Michal used a household idol to trick Saul and his men. It says an image. And we can be certain that it wasn't actually David's because the Lord was with him, but it was most likely hers. Saul obviously didn't raise his daughters up in a very godly fashion, and most likely she brought it in the house with her. And in those days, they had a lot of images, even of God. They would, we have this image of God to remind us of God, to pray as our own little household thing, Not sure necessarily what it was. David still should have gotten rid of it, shouldn't have allowed it in his house. Nonetheless, they use it here. And we see just how far Saul has gone in this endeavor to kill David. He says, you guys go kill him. It doesn't work. And so he says, I want to kill him. Bring him to me. Finally, when he confronts his daughter in verse 17, notice what he says. Why have you deceived me like this and sent my enemy away? He calls David his enemy. But all David has done is help Saul and honor Saul. When we are being led by the flesh, we can tend to see the people that help us as our enemies. When I was in youth ministry, I was the evil youth pastor. Hey, you shouldn't go to that party. Hey, whatever, man. You're just trying to. I just want to have fun with my friends. I just want to hang out with my friends. You don't want me to hang out with my friends? Maybe they'll ask me about God. I don't know. In what mind? What state? Hey, you shouldn't date that person because they're not a Christian. Ah, but they're good and they'll come to church. Stop. You're killing my vibe, bro. Not answering my texts anymore. Not answering my calls. Hey, you want to hang out? Nah, you're just going to kill my vibe. And when we're being led by the flesh, we tend to see that. No one likes being convicted. In fact, because of that, we can even think that way about the Lord. That the Lord, in a way, is our enemy, trying to ruin us and ruin our fun. And ruin our rights, take our rights away. These are my rights. If we had any rights as believers, they should have been nailed to the cross with Christ when we came to him. Just like he nailed all his rights as God when he came down. All he has done is nothing but good for us. And when we're being led by the flesh, fooled by the flesh, we can have that perspective that those trying to help us, point us to God, are our enemies. When in reality, they're doing nothing but good for us, including the Lord. We need to be careful. Verse 18. So David fled and escaped and went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and stayed at Naioth. Now it was told Saul, saying, take note, David is at Naioth in Ramah. Then Saul sent messengers to take David, and when they saw the group of prophets prophesying, and Samuel standing as leader over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. And when Saul was told, he sent other messengers, and they prophesied likewise. Then Saul sent messengers again. The definition of insanity, doing the same thing, expecting a different result. Sent messengers again, the third time, and they prophesied also. Then he also went to Ramah. They must be doing it wrong. Let me go and do it myself. And came to the great well that is at Secu. And he asked and said, where are Samuel and David? And someone said, indeed, they are at Naioth and Ramah. So he went there to Naioth and Ramah. Then the Spirit of God was upon him also, and he went on and prophesied until he came to Naioth and Ramah. And he also stripped off his clothes and prophesied before Samuel in like manner, and lay down naked all that day and all that night. Therefore they say, is Saul also among the prophets? Really interesting story. We see at the beginning here, David flees and escapes, and he goes to the one person he knows will give him sound wisdom, Samuel. the one who anointed him, the man of God at the time. Now when Saul hears that he is with Samuel, who Samuel obviously wasn't on good terms with Saul, after he departs and tells, hey, look, the Lord's removed his hand from you, they don't see each other until after their death, after his death. So Saul's not glad, hey, he's my enemy too. So he sends messengers to capture David, but when they get there, they start praising the Lord by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. 3 times. Sends messengers. 3 times. Every time they show up, they start praising the Lord. The Spirit of the Lord just hits them, and they start praising the Lord. What was happening here, and then finally Saul goes, and the same thing happens to him. What was happening was God was showing Saul and the others that they can do nothing to David because God was protecting him. You've come here to kill David. That's not going to happen. You're going to praise my name instead. Really interesting. Again, he didn't like that his messengers were doing it, so he goes to do it himself. Very prideful. Now what's interesting is that Saul was nowhere to be found when a Philistine was cursing God and his people. He was hiding, standing back, hanging out in his tent, probably thinking of ways he can get out of this. But when an innocent man is with a man of God, Saul is willing to go down and fight and prove a point and teach him a lesson. Again, in our flesh, we all of a sudden we're Superman. Nothing can hurt us. Nothing can stop us. We will do anything that's in our willpower to really build ourselves up. Now again, Saul is met with the same outcome as his messengers once he gets there, yet not only is he praising the Lord and prophesying, and that's really what that word means, is that they're praising the Lord, but he's also humbled by stripping down and praising the Lord. Kind of a similar story is Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, when he looks out on his kingdom and says, look at all this stuff I've done. And from that day forward, from that day for about 7 seasons, he's made like an animal, like a beast of the field, eating the grass, and even had, looked like an animal. Daniel kept him as a house pet, took care of him. Proverbs 21:1, Solomon, David's son, says, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. Like the rivers of water, he turns it wherever he wishes. The Lord was showing Saul and teaching Saul a very important lesson. You think you're in charge. You think you can go around what I'm doing, but you can't. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. I'm in control here, Saul. You're coming down here to destroy my servant, but you're going to end up praising me and humbling yourself. You're naked, praising me. Everyone's saying, as Saul among the prophets. God was in control, and Saul needed to be reminded of that. And I think David needed the reminder too. He's fleeing. He's escaping. He's running away. He's going to do a lot of that, actually. But he's reminded here, maybe for this brief moment, that God's protecting him. God's going to keep his promise to make him king one day. And we all need that reminder, that God's in control. That the enemy and the world and the people around us might be trying to do these things, but if God be for us, who can be against us? As Paul spoke to Timothy in 2 Timothy 1:7, for God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. None of those things describe Saul. He was led by his flesh, but someone led by the Spirit. power, love, and of a sound mind. Peace. Peace that surpasses all understanding, as Paul also speaks of in Philippians. So again, we see the contrast of a man being led by the flesh and a man being led by the Spirit, and the different outcomes, the different ways the Lord uses. You could be like Saul, where you're going to do your own thing, and it's my way or the highway. I'm stubborn, and I know what's wrong. I know what's right. But I'm going to do what I want to do, and you'll end up naked crying out to the Lord. Hopefully not literally. But you'll end up at a point where there's only one place to turn. And in the story of Nebuchadnezzar being turned into a beast, it's not until he looks up and finally humbles himself and says, "It was the Lord that gave me all of this. It was Him." Let me warn you, because I did the same thing, where I went my own way, knowing the Lord didn't want me to go that way. And it wasn't until I literally had no other place to go. I had to humble myself and say, "Lord, I know I've been wrong. And I could cry out to the Lord. And you know, the great thing is He's always there. Always there to answer us. Always there to pick us up. Where sin abounds, grace abounds that much more. The love and the grace that He has for us outshines anything we could do. Outdoes anything we could do. We shouldn't view God as our enemy, trying to kill our fun, trying to stop us from doing what we want to do. But as a loving Father who just wants the best for us. And if Saul had realized that chapters ago, I mean, we'd be talking about Saul in a whole different light. The great King Saul, a man after God's own heart. But he went after his flesh, a man after his own heart. Lord, we thank You that You've given us Your Holy Spirit to guide us and direct us. You've given us the Spirit, not of fear, that we should go around this life fearing the things that could or should or would happen to us. Or fearing the worst, but we could look to You, who've given us power, love, and a sound mind. Or we pray right now that You would, if there's anyone in here this evening that has fear in any area of their life, that You would fill them with Your Spirit to cast out that fear. They would be reminded of the love that You have, that perfect love that casts out all fear. We could have the courage of David to fight Goliath, to fight the Philistines, to take on 200 Philistine men. Not because of anything inside of us except You. Only because we know that if God be for us, who could be against us? And Lord, let us be reminded of that You are for us. Lord, I pray that we are not, Lord, we were once Your enemies. Thankful for that. But because You sent Your Son, we are no longer Your enemies, but Your friends. No, not just Your friends, but Your sons and daughters, Lord. And so I pray that we would just put all of our trust in You tonight. Lord, I pray that You would use us wherever we go. Lord, that people would see us, see You in us. They would see that the Lord is with us. And maybe even it would cause them to be afraid. Hey, there's something different about them. So Lord, I pray that You would use us mightily wherever we're at, wherever You have us. That we would be led by Your Spirit, not by our flesh. It's in Your name we pray.